April 14th, 1865, our beloved 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was shot while seeing the play, Our American Cousin. This tragedy shook the nation, and they demanded that the assassin and his accomplices be put to justice.
I believe that there are men who want to take my life. If anyone is willing to give his life for mine, there is nothing that can prevent that.
Abraham Lincoln, 1865. Lincoln knew he didn't have much longer to live, and soon he became the final death of the Civil War. Traveling back, Abraham Lincoln received hate mail as soon as he became president in 1860. The mail was from Southern citizens and usually had threats of assassination. Abraham Lincoln often went to Ford's Theater during the Civil War. In November of 1863, Lincoln saw the play The Marble Heart. He distinctly remembered seeing the leading actor, John Wilkes Booth. Booth hated President Lincoln. In 1864, he stopped acting and signed as a spy for the Confederate Army.
This country was formed for the white, not the black man. My love is for the South alone, nor do I deem it a dishonor attempting to make for her a prisoner of this man, to whom she owes so much of misery.
John Wilkes Booth. During the Civil War, John Wilkes Booth daringly plotted to abduct Lincoln. Booth's accomplices were Sam Arnold, Michael O'Lofton, John Surratt, Mary Surratt, George Azerodt, and David Harold. Booth knew from an unknown source that Lincoln was supposed to attend Ford's Theater. His plan was to drag Lincoln out toward Maryland, where there were Confederate supporters. From there, Booth and his conspirators would bring Lincoln to Richmond, Virginia. His plan was to exchange Lincoln's safety for Confederate prisoners of war. However, on the night of the play, Abraham Lincoln never showed up. There would be no other opportunity for Booth to carry out his plan. No one is quite sure why, but after this failure, Booth changed his plans from kidnapping to murder. Most of John Wilkes Booth's followers were ready for a new plan. However, Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Lofton were not, so they left the conspiracy. Booth and his remaining conspirators often held meetings at Mary Surratt's tavern. They agreed on assassinating certain members of the Union American government. During one of these meetings, Booth's followers decided to sell his horse and carriage to get money to fund this risky plan. Later, he needed a horse to escape from the crime scene. Booth sent a letter to Vice President Andrew Johnson. It said,
Don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home?
This letter would show that Johnson was behind the conspiracy and used Booth to carry out his plan. The letter, however, was never received. Lewis Payne, also known as Lewis Powell, joined Booth. He was assigned to murder Secretary of State William Seward. On April 14th, John Wilkes Booth went to go get his mail at Ford's Theater. There, his friend Harry Ford told him the president would be watching the play that evening. Booth decided that this was the time to take action. Lincoln invited General Grant and his wife to the play, but they declined. He later invited Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. They were the only guests of the Lincolns at the theater. Booth and his accomplices met on the 14th to go over the plan one last time. After murdering several members of the government, Booth and his team would hide out in Surratt's tavern. When the president arrived at Ford's Theater, Booth was already there. John Parker, Lincoln's bodyguard, left his post to go get a drink. No one knows exactly who let Booth into the presidential box. He entered the box and walked toward Lincoln, with his gun drawn to the back of Lincoln's head. Booth fired, while the sound of the gun was covered up by laughter. Major Henry Rathbone knocked the gun out of Booth's hands and tried to prevent him from escaping. Booth took out a knife and stabbed Major Rathbone in the arm. Then he tried to jump off the stage. He landed with a broken bone in his leg, turned, and shouted,
Sic semper tyrannis,
which means, thus it shall ever be for tyrants. Booth ran out the back door of the theater where his horse was being held. Meanwhile, Clara Harris shouted,
The president's been shot! The president's been shot!
Later, John Wilkes Booth traveled to Mary Surratt's tavern, but never got off his horse, so he kept going down the road to Dr. Mudd, who had no idea that the president was assassinated. Dr. Samuel Mudd fixed Booth's leg and gave him a place to sleep. The next morning, Booth and Harold ran away to avoid capture. Secretary of War Edward Stanton was in charge of finding the unknown assassin. The news to look out for anything suspicious was spread across the country. Stanton, along with several Union officers, soon had hundreds of suspects. Booth, however, was the prime suspect. When a letter of Booth's plans was found, it was certain that he committed the crime. The search was on to find John Wilkes Booth and his accomplices. 2 days after Booth and David Harold left Mudd's house, Mudd went to the authorities. They falsely accused and arrested him for being an accomplice. Before Booth and Harold could cross into Virginia, they had to hide out in Zacchaeus Swamp. The river into Virginia was guarded by Union soldiers. The soldiers made several unsuccessful attempts to capture Booth. Eventually, they crossed into Virginia on a skiff, led by Thomas A. Jones. The fugitives arranged for a fisherman to ferry them over to Port Royal. When they arrived, a Confederate soldier got Booth, who was badly injured, under the care of the local farmer, Richard Henry Garrett. David Harold, with a few Confederate soldiers, arrived with news.
The Yankees are coming! The Yankees are coming!
Because of the Garrett suspicions, Booth and Harold were forced to hide in the tobacco barn. The Union soldiers trapped the Confederates and forced them to reveal Booth's and Harold's location. Soon, they had the barn completely surrounded. Harold surrendered and gave himself up when the soldiers, led by Lieutenant Edward Doherty, threatened to burn the barn. After Booth refused to do the same, the barn was set ablaze. Booth tried to escape, but was shot in the neck by Sergeant Boston Corbett. The government wanted Booth alive, but Corbett claimed that Providence had told him to shoot. The next morning, John Wilkes Booth succumbed to his wound. His final words,
Tell my mother I did it for my country, that I died for my country.
This assassination led to the founding of the Secret Service on July 5th, 1865. Edwin Stanton rounded up the other 7 conspirators. They were each put on trial. Edmund Spangler was sentenced to 6 years in prison for not knowing of the assassination, but for helping Booth escape by holding his horse. Samuel Arnold, Dr. Mudd, and Michael O'Lofton were given life sentences of hard labor for being involved with the kidnapping, but not the assassination. Death by hanging, however, was given to Mary Surratt, George Azerodt, Lewis Powell, and David Harold for being directly involved in the assassination. John Surratt escaped to Rome, but was forced back to the U.S., tried, and found innocent.